Think about the last time you made a decision that surprised you. Not a small decision, not a choice about what to eat or which route to take, but a decision of genuine consequence. A choice about a relationship, a career, a pattern of behavior, a response to a person or a situation that mattered. Think about the last time you found yourself in a situation you had been in before. In its essential emotional shape, if not in its specific external details. And notice that your response was almost exactly what it had been the last time. The same impulse, the same quality of reaction, perhaps a slightly different surface, a slightly more sophisticated vocabulary for it, but underneath, recognizably, disturbingly, the same, if you have spent any significant time trying to understand yourself. You have probably already noticed that a surprising amount of what feels like deliberate, freely chosen behavior is actually the replaying of patterns whose origins lie somewhere behind you rather than in the present moment you are supposedly responding to. You did not consciously decide to choose partners who require you to manage their emotions. You did not consciously decide to become unable to finish creative projects at a certain stage. You did not consciously decide to respond to the specific texture of a particular kind of authority with the specific combination of deference and resentment that you have noticed yourself producing, reliably across entirely different contexts. These patterns did not arise from your conscious intentions. They arose from somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere that is still operating inside you with an authority and a consistency that your conscious intentions rarely manage to match. Carl. Jung spent his career illuminating exactly this territory. His central insight, which he developed across decades of clinical observation, and which remains, a century after its original formulation, one of the most practically useful pieces of psychological understanding available, is that the past does not simply recede. It does not fade in the way that distance makes things fade in the visual field, becoming smaller and less distinct as the interval between then and now increases. The past that has been genuinely integrated into the conscious personality does recede in something like this way. But the past that has not been integrated, that was not fully processed at the time it occurred because the person who experienced it lacked the resources. The safety or the support to do so does not recede at all. It operates from inside the current moment, from inside the current decision, from inside the current relationship. It applies its original logic to present circumstances with a persistence and a consistency that can be genuinely bewildering to the person experiencing it, precisely because they are not aware that it is happening. This video is going to trace that dynamic from its theoretical roots in Jung's concept of the autonomous complex, through the specific mechanism by which early experience becomes the template for present behavior without the person's conscious awareness or consent. Before we go further, it is worth sitting with the specific discomfort that this observation tends to produce, because that discomfort is itself informative. Most people, when they first genuinely encounter the idea that their behavior is being significantly organized by mechanisms that operate below their conscious awareness, experience a specific and recognizable combination of recognition and resistance. The recognition is immediate and uncomfortable. The sense that yes, this is actually what is happening. That the patterns one has been observing in oneself, with confusion and sometimes with distress, are indeed organized, are indeed consistent, are indeed coming from somewhere older than the current moment. The resistance follows quickly, and it is the resistance of the ego, the conscious personality, to the implication that it is not as fully in charge of itself as it believes itself to be. The ego finds it considerably more comfortable to understand its patterns as responses to current circumstances, as the results of other people's behavior or unfortunate external conditions, than to understand them as the operations of autonomous interior structures whose origins lie in experiences it has long since nominally moved past. But it is precisely this resistance, this preference for external explanation over internal examination, that ensures the past continues to run the present unopposed. You cannot begin to address what you will not begin to look at. And its clinical implications, specifically the research that is confirmed, remarkable precision, what Jung observed clinically about the persistence of early relational patterns into adult life. We will look at the philosophy of habit and character. Specifically, Aristotle's insistence that we become what we repeatedly do, and William James's early psychological account of how habitual patterns crystallize into something that feels, from the inside, indistinguishable from nature. We will examine the mythology of repetition, compulsion, which appears across cultures and forms ranging from the curse that follows a family line to the figure of Sisyphus, condemned to perpetual repetition. And we will look at what Jung's framework reveals about both the mechanism of this repetition and the specific work that interrupts it. And we will walk through the concrete, practically applicable practices that Jung's analytical psychology makes available for developing a genuinely different relationship to the past that is running your life. Not by erasing it or transcending it, but by finally, fully, consciously meeting it in a way that transforms its authority from an unconscious one-to-one you can actually choose to engage with, or decline by the end. The patterns you have been living from without quite knowing, it will be more visible to you. And visibility, as Jung insisted throughout his career, is not a small thing. Visibility is the beginning of the only genuine freedom. It's available to a human being in relation to their own history. The concept of the complex, which we have explored in other contexts in this series, provides the most precise theoretical framework available for understanding exactly how the past continues to operate in the present. A complex, in Jung's technical sense, is an autonomous psychic structure that forms around a particularly charged emotional experience, or a series of such experiences, and that then operates within the psyche with a degree of independence from the conscious ego that most people find genuinely surprising when they first fully understand it. The complex is not simply a memory. It is a living, active, functionally independent system within the psyche that has its own emotional logic, its own characteristic patterns of response, its own specific triggers, and its own consistent effects on perception, judgment, and behavior. It operates in the most literal sense, like a subpersonality, a partially autonomous inner figure whose history is located in the past, but whose effects are entirely present. The specific mechanism by which the complex exerts its authority over present behavior is the mechanism of projection and pattern matching. The complex contains at its core a specific emotional configuration organized around a particular kind of experience. Being shamed, being abandoned, being overwhelmed, being consistently misunderstood, being required to manage another person's emotional state, and it continuously scans the present environment for features that match. However, approximately the features of that original configuration, when it finds a match, it activates. And when it activates, it does several things simultaneously that together constitute what we experience as being in the grip of the past. It filters perception, causing the person to notice and amplify the features of the current situation that match the original configuration while minimizing or missing the features that do not match. A person whose complex is organized around experiences of being abandoned will notice with unusual acuity every slight or ambiguous indicator of potential withdrawal in a current relationship, and will tend to miss or discount the indicators of genuine presence and commitment that coexist alongside them. It activates the emotional response that was appropriate to the original situation, not the one that is appropriate to the current one. The intensity of the emotional response is proportionate to the original wounding rather than to the current trigger, which is why complex activation so regularly produces responses that seem, from the outside, and sometimes even from the inside, disproportionate to the situation that produced them, and it generates the behavioral response that was most adaptive in the original situation, regardless of whether it is adaptive in the current one. The person who learned early and thoroughly that their own emotional needs were dangerous to express will respond to complex activation by suppressing their emotional expression, even in contexts where expressing it would be entirely safe and entirely appropriate. The developmental psychology of attachment has confirmed, across decades of careful empirical research, the specific mechanism Jung described clinically, The original research of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, extended and refined by generations of attachment researchers since, has established that the specific patterns of relating developed in the earliest years of life in response to the caregiving environment are not simply learned behaviors that can be straightforwardly unlearned when circumstances change. They are internalized as what Bowlby called internal working models, specific templates for how relationships work. What can be expected from other people, what is safe to want, and what is dangerous to need, that operate largely below the level of conscious awareness, and that exert a consistent organizing influence on adult relationship behavior. The person who developed an anxious attachment pattern in response to inconsistent early caregiving will bring the specific relational logic of that pattern. Hypervigilance to potential abandonment, driven reassurance seeking, difficulty tolerating the ordinary ambiguity of adult relationships, into adult relationships that have objectively entirely different characteristics from the caregiving environment that produced the pattern. The pattern is not responding to what is actually present. It is responding to what was once present, filtered through the internal working model that experience built. Mary Main's later development of the adult attachment interview, a research instrument that examines not simply the content of adults' memories of their early relational experiences, but the specific way they narrate and organize those memories, revealed a finding of particular relevance to Jung's framework. Main found that the single most reliable predictor of a parent's attachment classification, and therefore of the attachment pattern their own child was likely to develop, was not what had happened to the parent in their own childhood, but whether the parent had developed a coherent, integrated narrative understanding of what had happened. Parents who had experienced genuinely difficult early histories, but who had been able to make sense of those histories, who could speak of them with appropriate effect, with appropriate complexity, without either dismissing their significance or being overwhelmed by them, reliably raised, securely attached children. Parents who had experienced similar or even milder histories, but who had not been able to integrate them into a coherent narrative, who either minimized and dismissed the significance of early experience, or who became flooded and disorganized when attempting to discuss it, reliably transmitted insecure patterns to their children. The past that has been genuinely integrated does not determine the future in the same way as the past that has not been met. This is precisely what Jung means when he says that the past is still running your life, not in the metaphorical sense that past experiences have shaped who you are, which is trivially true of everyone, in the specific clinical sense that there are autonomous structures within your psyche that are organized around the emotional logic of past experiences, and that are continuously applying that logic to present circumstances. Without your awareness and without your consent, the past is not behind you. It is inside you, and it is active, and it is currently making decisions that you believe you are making. Aristotle's account of character and habit provides the philosophical counterpart to this psychological picture. For Aristotle, character is not something we simply have, a fixed set of properties that were either given to us at birth or that we acquired somehow. Character is what we repeatedly do, the accumulated residue of thousands of choices and responses and patterns of engagement with the world that have been repeated enough times to become, in a functional sense, automatic. The virtuous person, in Aristotle's framework, is not someone who successfully overrides their inclinations through effortful willpower in each individual situation. It is someone who has, through practice and habituation, developed inclinations that are themselves virtuous, so that the virtuous response arises naturally rather than requiring continuous effortful management. The problem, which Aristotle recognized, in which the psychological tradition has developed considerably further, is that this same mechanism operates for patterns that are anything but virtuous, patterns of avoidance, of reactivity, of relational dysfunction, of self-sabotage, that have been repeated enough times to acquire exactly the same quality of automaticity that virtue acquires through repeated right action. The character we have is, in significant part, the character we were shaped into by circumstances we did not choose and experiences we could not have anticipated, and it operates with exactly the same naturalness and exactness and taken for granted, quality that genuinely chosen character operates with. It feels like us. It feels like simply how we are. Because it has been us for long enough that the distinction between who we are and what we were shaped to be has become genuinely difficult to locate. William James. Who was among the first to examine habit from a rigorously psychological perspective? Describe the specific mechanism by which patterns crystallize into what feels like nature with a clarity that anticipates. In important ways, the neuroscientific understanding of habit that has developed in subsequent decades. For James, the nervous system is essentially a habit-forming machine, continuously encoding frequently repeated patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior as increasingly automatic sequences that require progressively less conscious attention and effort to execute. The pattern that was once effortful and deliberate becomes, through repetition, first routine, and then essentially invisible. A background operation of the nervous system that proceeds without conscious monitoring or conscious choice. This is enormously adaptive when the patterns being encoded are genuinely useful. It becomes the primary mechanism of psychological suffering. When the patterns being encoded are responses to early conditions of threat, deprivation, or overwhelming experience that no longer obtain, but that the nervous system has no automatic mechanism for recognizing as outdated, neuroscience has since confirmed and extended James's account with considerable precision. The research on neuroplasticity and habit formation has established that repeated experience physically modifies the neural architecture of the brain, strengthening synaptic connections associated with frequently repeated patterns and weakening those associated with patterns that fall into disuse. The pattern that has been most frequently repeated becomes, at the neural level, the path of least resistance, the route that activates most readily in response to relevant environmental triggers. The default response, the neuroscientific research on what is called state-dependent memory adds another important dimension here. This research has established that memories and the behavioral patterns associated with them are most readily accessed when the person is in the same physiological and emotional state that was present during the original learning. This means that the specific emotional activation produced by complex activation, the surge of fear, shame, or rage that accompanies the moment of triggering, actually increases the accessibility of the old pattern and decreases the accessibility of new, consciously learned alternatives. The very state that most urgently calls for a different response is the state in which the old response is most neurologically available, and the new alternative is least available. This is why people who have developed genuine insight into their patterns in calm, reflective conditions so regularly find themselves reverting to the old pattern in the moments of actual activation. The insight is real and the intention is genuine. But the neurological architecture of the moment of activation works against the application of both. This is one of the clearest available explanations for why psychological change requires repeated, embodied practice in conditions of genuine activation rather than simply insight developed in conditions of calm reflection. Not simply understanding that the pattern exists and where it came from, but the specific kind of repeated, embodied, genuinely felt alternative experience that creates new neural pathways alongside the old ones, gradually shifting the balance between the entrenched default and the new alternative until the alternative becomes the new default. This is why understanding one's past, gaining insight into the origins of one's patterns, is necessary but not sufficient for genuine change. The past is encoded not simply in memories and narratives that can be addressed through understanding, but in the body, in the nervous system, in the procedural and implicit memory systems that operate entirely below the level of verbal understanding and that require a different kind of engagement to actually shift, the mythology of repetition compulsion, which Freud was the first to name as a specific psychological phenomenon, but which Jung developed in a considerably more nuanced theoretical framework, appears in remarkably consistent form across an enormous range of cultural traditions. The figure of Sisyphus condemned to roll his boulder up the hill, only to watch it roll back down, and to begin again, eternally, is one of the most widely recognized images in Western mythology of this specific experience. But the Sisyphean myth encodes something beyond the simple frustration of repeated failure. Read through a Jungian lens. The repetition of Sisyphus is not random. It is structured. The same boulder, the same hill, the same moment of apparent achievement and subsequent collapse. The compulsion is organized around a specific pattern, not simply a general tendency toward futile effort. And this specificity is precisely what the repetition compulsion in psychological life also presents. It is not that everything goes wrong. It is that the same thing keeps going wrong, in the same emotional shape, across entirely different external circumstances. The specific content of the pattern varies. The emotional structure does not. The myth of the family curse, which appears across Greek tragedy, Norse mythology, and a wide range of folk and literary traditions, encodes a related insight from a different angle. The house of Atreus, in Greek tragedy, offers perhaps the most fully developed mythological exploration of this intergenerational repetition, through Tantalus, Pelops, Atreus, Agamemnon. And finally Orestes, the same essential wound. The wound of betrayal, violent usurpation, and the severing of right relationship between parent and child propagates through generations. Each generation enacting a slightly different version of the same essential drama, until Orestes, guided by Athena and by the institution of the court of law, finally manages to break the cycle not through further violence, but through the specific act of bringing the repetition into conscious, public, collectively witnessed examination. The Orestia is, among other things, a mythological map of exactly the process Jung describes in clinical terms. The cycle of unconscious repetition broken through the act of making the pattern conscious and bringing it into a relationship with something larger, more encompassing, and more genuinely just than the compulsive logic of the wound that has been driving it. The myth of Oedipus carries a related and equally precise psychological encoding. Oedipus's tragedy is not simply the tragedy of a man who unknowingly fulfills a terrible prophecy. It is the tragedy of a man who has organized his entire conscious identity around not knowing, around the specific refusal to look at the truth about his own origins, his own past, his own identity. The oracle's prophecy was available from the beginning. Every opportunity for genuine self-knowledge was present throughout the story. What drove the tragedy was not the inevitability of the events, but the specific, consistent driven refusal to actually look at what was available to be seen. The blinding that Oedipus inflicts on himself at the moment of recognition is the mythological image of what the psyche does when the truth it has been organized around avoiding finally breaks through into consciousness, the specific, overwhelming quality of encounter with what has been most thoroughly not seen. But what follows the blinding, the long years of wandering and eventual arrival at Colonus, where Oedipus finally achieves a kind of wisdom and even a sanctified death, is the mythological image of what the genuine encounter with the past eventually produces when it is fully faced. Not simply suffering, a depth, a gravity, a specific quality of understanding that was not available before the encounter, is not in its deepest psychological reading simply a metaphor for genetic inheritance or social disadvantage, though it is those things too. It is a mythological encoding of the specific mechanism by which unprocessed psychological material, complexes, relational patterns, unintegrated trauma, passes from one generation to the next, not through the blood, but through the only transmission medium available within a family system. Relationship itself, the specific quality of emotional presence and emotional absence that a parent brings to their child, which is itself organized, in significant part, by the unprocessed material the parent received from their own parents. The family curse is the Jungian wound complex operating at the systemic level. What was not met in one generation finds expression in the next, seeking in the next generation. A specific encounter that was unavailable in the previous one, the specific way this intergenerational transmission operates is worth examining directly, because it is one of the most clinically significant and most consistently underestimated dimensions of the way the past runs present life. A parent who carries an unprocessed wound complex organized around, for example. The experience of being consistently shamed does not typically transmit the content of that wound to their child through deliberate, conscious behavior. They transmit it through the specific texture of their emotional presence with the child, through the quality of attention they can and cannot offer, through the specific situations in which they become unavailable, reactive, or overwhelming, through the relational positions that their own complex most reliably generates. The child who grows up in this relational field develops, in response to it, their own internal working model, their own set of adaptations to the specific emotional landscape that the parent's unprocessed material creates. These adaptations then become the child's own complex, their own pattern, their own way of relating to themselves and others, until they do the work of meeting what was not met, or pass it along in turn. The practical question this entire framework raises is the same one that every psychologically serious tradition eventually arrives at. Given that the past is running your life through mechanisms that operate largely below conscious awareness, and given that simple insight and conscious intention are insufficient to change these mechanisms, what actually does change them? Jung's answer, developed across decades of clinical work and embodied in the entire practice of analytical psychology, involves several specific and interrelated forms of engagement. The first and most foundational is the development of what might be called historical self-awareness. The specific capacity to identify one's own recurring patterns with enough clarity and specificity that they can be observed rather than simply lived. This requires a quality of honest self-examination that most people find genuinely uncomfortable, because the patterns that most need to be identified are precisely the ones that feel most natural, most simply like how things are, most like simply who one is. The practice of tracking one's own emotional responses across different situations, specifically looking for recurrences of the same emotional quality in circumstances that differ in their external details but share a specific feeling tone, is the most immediately available route into this kind of historical self-awareness. When you notice the same quality of emotional experience recurring across apparently different situations, you are detecting the signature of a complex. You are identifying for the first time something that was operating before you noticed it. The second practice is what Jung called circumambulation, the process of approaching the central content of a complex not through direct confrontation but through a gradual, spiraling movement that repeatedly circles the core material from different angles and at different distances, allowing increasingly close and increasingly honest encounter without the overwhelming that direct confrontation might produce. This practice, in its most immediately applicable form, involves asking the question, what does this remind me of? In response to each emotional activation that the pattern tracking exercise reveals. Not what should this remind me of, not what is the obvious analogy that I have already identified, but what does this actually, immediately, viscerally remind me of? The answer to this question, followed honestly and without premature interpretation, almost always leads directly toward the original wounding experience from which the current pattern arose. The third practice is body-centered, and it addresses the dimension of the entrenched past pattern that neither historical self-awareness nor circumambulation can fully reach on their own. The dimension that is encoded in the body and in the procedural and implicit memory systems rather than in verbal narrative memory. The specific bodily sensations that accompany complex activation, the particular quality of contraction in the chest, the specific texture of the tension in the shoulders, the exact quality of the breath change that accompanies the familiar emotional activation, are not simply symptoms of the psychological pattern. They are the psychological pattern experienced in its most direct and most accessible form. The practice of deliberately attending to these bodily sensations when they arise, of staying with them rather than immediately trying to resolve or escape them, of following them with curiosity rather than managing them with control, creates the specific kind of somatic awareness that is a necessary precondition for the embodied shift that genuine change in deeply entrenched patterns requires. The fourth practice involves what Jung called the encounter with the inner figure, the specific application of active imagination to the past experience or early relational situation that the pattern tracking and circumambulation have revealed as the source of the current pattern. Rather than simply remembering the past experience as an event that occurred to a younger version of oneself, active imagination involves entering into a genuine living, imaginative encounter with that earlier experience and with the figures who populated it, particularly the figures whose behavior generated the complex that has been operating since. This encounter is not about revisiting the past in order to change it, which is neither possible nor the goal. It is about completing in the interior space of imagination something that was left incomplete in the actual past, and about developing in that completion a genuinely different relationship to the material that has been organizing the present from behind the scenes. The fifth practice is the deliberate cultivation of new relational experiences, the specific kind of genuine, embodied, emotionally present encounters with other people that provide the alternative experience the nervous system needs in order to build new neural pathways alongside the old ones. This is, in many cases, the function that the therapeutic relationship most directly serves in Jung's framework, offering a consistent, genuine, emotionally honest encounter with another person that is specifically structured to be different from the relational experiences that generated the original complex. But the therapeutic relationship is not the only available arena for this kind of new experience. Any relationship in which genuine emotional honesty is present, in which the specific relational positions that the complex most reliably generates are gently but consistently disrupted by the other person's refusal to occupy the complementary role, offers the same kind of corrective relational experience that gradually shifts the balance between the old pattern and the new alternative. There is a specific quality of experience that becomes available through this work that is worth naming directly, because it is, in the end, one of the most compelling reasons for doing it. Most people who have lived from their past patterns for long enough to have noticed their operation describe, when they begin to genuinely meet those patterns rather than simply live them, a specific and sometimes disorienting sense of spaciousness, as though something that had been pressing on them from behind, something they had been leaning forward against without knowing it, has eased slightly, and the forward-leaning posture that had felt simply like how they held themselves turns out to have been a continuous, low-grade effort to manage a pressure they had never clearly identified. This spaciousness is not the absence of difficulty. The past that has been genuinely met is not the past that no longer influences your life. It is the past whose influence has become visible and chosen rather than invisible and compulsory. You still know the old patterns. You still feel their pull. But you have developed through the specific work of making them conscious, the specific capacity that makes all the difference between the freedom that is genuinely available and the freedom that is merely theoretically possible. The capacity to notice that the pattern is running before you have already run it, the capacity to stand, briefly and with genuine effort, in the gap between the familiar impulse and the familiar response, and to make a choice that is, for the first time, actually yours. This is what Jung meant when he said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The patterns that are running your life right now are not fate. They are the past operating in the present through mechanisms that become the moment you can see them, the beginning of something genuinely different. Not the end of the story. The beginning of the part of it that is actually yours to write. There is a final observation worth making, one that Jung himself returned to frequently in his later work, the work of meeting the past, of developing the specific conscious relationship to one's own history that transforms its authority from unconscious and compulsory to visible and chosen, is not a project that has a completion date. It is not something that gets done and then requires no further attention. The past does not disappear when it has been met. The complex does not dissolve when it has been identified. What changes is the relationship. It's the quality of the ongoing encounter between the conscious personality and the autonomous interior structures that the past has built from an unconscious one, in which the structures simply operate without the conscious ego's knowledge, to a conscious one, in which the ego can recognize the activation, can choose its response rather than simply enacting it. and can bring to each new instance of the pattern's appearance the specific quality of deliberate, informed attention that gradually, over time, shifts the balance of authority from the past to the present. This is not a small achievement. It is, in fact, one of the most significant achievements available to a human being in the course of an ordinary human life. The freedom it produces is not the dramatic, absolute freedom of someone who has been entirely released from the influence of their history. It is the more modest, more genuinely available freedom of someone who knows what that history contains, who has developed an honest and ongoing relationship with it, and who can therefore choose, in the specific moments that matter, to respond from where they actually are rather than from where they once were. That is the freedom Jung spent his career pointing toward. It is enough. It is, in practice, considerably more than most people ever achieve, and it begins as every genuine psychological development begins, with the specific, uncomfortable, genuinely necessary act of looking honestly at what has been there all along,